Welcome back to the Plan Your Federal Retirement Podcast. I'm your co-host, Micah and with me, joining me all the way from Washington State, we have the amazing Christian Sakamoto. Christian, how you doing, sir?
Micah, I'm doing well. Had an eventful weekend, battling some sickness, but otherwise, I'm actually pretty healthy now, and I'm looking forward to Christmas. As we're recording this, it's just a week before Christmas. Kids are getting super excited, and we're doing all those fun holiday activities with baking cookies and watching Christmas movies and having hot chocolate. It's just a lot of fun right now.
Oh, that's fantastic, right? I know this is episode's gonna air in January. We try to get them out a little bit more in advance, kind of recorded for you guys in the can, but this is a great time, right? I hope you guys all had a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. And we're able to spend some time with the family and be able to put a lot of things together on kind of what this new year is going to look like. But Christian, as we wrap up 2023, we've seen some interesting things in the markets. And while this podcast, we don't really talk about it in like investments and markets and day trading because we don't believe in those type of things, but we do talk about investments for the long run, which is what we want to talk about today. And kind of a question that sometimes that we'll get, not so much from clients, but from other people coming in is, why is my retirement losing money? Why is the markets going up and my retirement account's going down?
That's right. And I think it'd be good to talk about that today. There are a few points that we'd like to mention as to why that might be the case. And I think the spoiler alert is ultimately it comes down to a mindset, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. What would be the first thing that we're thinking about that our retirement accounts might be losing money? Is it going to be that our investment diversification? Is that going to be probably the first thing that we're going to be thinking about?
Well, boy, the first thing I always look at, this is a little bit tongue in cheek, so forgive me, but is, why does investment diversification bite? That's the first thing I think about, right? We always talk about you have to diversify your investments. You have to do these things, which is fantastic. There's a good reason why, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But one of the main problems with investment diversification is people get pigeonholed. People get looking at the wrong things. They have a diversified investment, but then they hear the market was up 20%. They're like, how come I didn't go up 20%? And that's because they have diversified investment. But I'm diversified, but I still want all of the growth. And so there's a cost to being diversified. There's a cost to separating that money out, and it kind of bites a little bit, but sometimes that's the price that's worth paying.
100%. Then we have to look at it and say, if we're going to play the diversification game, which we're all big fans of, is what is it that we're diversified in? Are we diversified amongst stocks and bonds and cash? Or are we diversified amongst the different stocks that are available, such as the C Fund, which is 500 of the largest U.S.-based companies, right? The S&P 500 is what we're referring to under the C Fund. But then if we compare that to small cap funds, which represents the S Fund, which is a lot more smaller companies, they're comparing apples to oranges, possibly. If we all expand that even further, we can look at the I Fund, which is international. The I Fund in particular is a lot of European funds, but from that perspective, again, there's diversification amongst the same type of goal, like growth, and then there's diversification amongst comparing two different things all together completely between growth and fixed income like bonds and also cash. So what are your thoughts on that?
Boy, it's a great thing, right? And so let's go ahead and pull up. I got the tsp.gov pulled up right now. Now, these will be just a little bit different. Again, we're recording this right before the end of the year versus, when this kind of airs. But let's look at these numbers a little bit. Now, Christian, here's the thing when it comes to investment diversification that we all forget. We all forget what happened last cycle, right? We all forget where the market was just a second ago. And I have like kind of three experiences I was sharing with you as we were pre-gaming for this with people that I talked to that was like, oh my gosh, it's so happy. The C Fund is up, 18%, 20%, whatever this number is. And we're so excited about it. I was like, yeah, that sure beats a few months ago. And there's a pause. And I was like, oh, you already forgot that it was down just a few months ago. And then it's recovered. And they're like, oh, yeah, it was, right? It's just now kind of recently it's popped up. And I say, yeah, it really is better than 2022. Remember, just last year, well, I guess if it airs in 24, it's almost 2 years ago, right? But just last year in 2022, the C fund was down 18%. The S fund was down 26%. The I fund was down 14, I'm rounding, 14%, right? The F fund, F is in the bond fund, was down almost 13% in
Yeah.
2022. Now, I know that's a lot of percentages we're throwing out there. But the reason for we talk about this is we got to understand what we're owning. And I'd say that's
Mm.
kind of the number one mistake that retirees, federal employees, et cetera, make is we don't really have an understanding of what we own. We have an emotional experience. We're like, holy crap, the TSP is up 20%. I want that, right? Well,
Yep.
what in the TSP? I don't know. Just the TSP is up 20%. Let's go buy it. And so we put money in there, but we don't really understand those things. So kind of before we get into investment diversification and how that needs to be set up, we really need to pause and say, what's our written investment rules? Now, I know I'm sucking the fun out of this. Forgive me. It's so much more fun to talk about things that are going up and how we should invest money and those other great things. But to be successful at this, and we're going to define what we think success is, we got to slow this down just a little bit. And Christian, I'll ask you, whenever we're thinking about investing, our written investment rules, what's the number one rule we're talking to clients about when it comes to investing?
I'd say the number one rule is, when do you need this money? What's that goal that we're solving for? And when are we
Yes.
going to need that money?
Oh, that is so important, right? Now, I'm just going to pick again on the C fund. Now, for all the people out there like, Mike, you're just picking on the TSP. Well, yes and no. That's their commonality with federal employees, right? We all have the TSP. You all have the TSP. And it's a good tool, but we got to understand how it works. But Christian, to your point, I'm just looking at these returns. In 2023, it was up, as of year-to-date numbers, 20%. 2022 is down 18%. 21 it was up 28%. It was 18%, then 31, then down, right? So you have a bunch of different rates of returns going on right here. So when we need the money is really, really important. If you need the money and the market's going to be down 20% like it has been on multiple occasions, right? Even these are just year-end numbers. You can go out throughout the year and there's multiple times the market is ebbing and flowing. You're taking a pretty big risk at having to sell at a loss. And that's what we're trying to avoid by that win question, right, Christian?
That's exactly it. If you wanted to buy a house in 3 years and all of your money that you had was in the equivalent of the C fund, probably not a good smart strategy if we have another 2021, or sorry, 2022, right? When it goes down 18%. So we want to make sure that we
Yeah.
have a goal in mind to say, when we need this money, we got to make sure that it's structured in a way, set up in a way between growth, income, and cash, that we know how we're invested, so that whether, again, it's a retirement goal or it's a buying a house goal, we know that we're in a good spot and we're not worried that the market is going to be down. We've already built into that the market could go down. Therefore, we have enough set aside that we're not concerned that it does.
Yeah, amen. Right now, we could go back. I'm going to date myself here, myself and not Christian, but I'll date myself. So, but go back to 2000, 2001, 2002, right? In that period in time, the market was down, Christian, and you know this. It was down for 3 consecutive years, 10%. I think it was 10% for 2 years and 22% one of the years, something of that nature, round
Yeah.
numbers, right? So, but it was down for 3 years. So when we come up with these rules that Christian's talking about, it's because of reality, right? In theory, the market's up, anywhere between 8 to 10% every single year. But that's because we're averaging the markets, the ups and the downs, but we got to manage those downturns. Now, long-term investors, we don't need this money. We're more than 5 years from retirement, and we're going to let it invest and we're going to let it grow, and we're not going to panic when the market fluctuates. Well, then fantastic, right? Let's take that long-term mentality, that long-term approach. But Christian, what's kind of that time frame we should be looking at? Let's say we don't want to leave money kind of north of that 5 years. Let me ask a different question. When do we need to be, how far out should we be looking that when we need money, we need to start being more conservative with it?
I'd say it's in that 5 year window. So when we're getting within that 5 year window, we really need to be looking at the investments and trying to strip away a little bit, moving them into and out of the market and into cash and the bond type equivalent. The reason why, and we've said this before on the podcast, my clients know this, is we go back to 2008 when the market was down for a total of 5 years, right? From 2008, 9, 10,
Right?
11, 12, right? So we have to look at that history and say, goodness, hopefully this doesn't happen. But God forbid, when it does, we want to make sure we've got that 5 years set aside. So for whatever that income need is, whether it's retirement income, whether it's to buy a car, whether it's to remodel the house or purchase a house, those dollars aren't going to be affected by the market, right? And that's the 5 year rule.
Now, the 5 year rule is it's a rule of thumb. It depends on a few things, but it's a good place to start. What money do we need to spend in the next 5 years? And it shouldn't belong invested. We talked before about kind of our bucket strategy. We like to have 1 to 2 years of distributions in cash. Now, sometimes we get pushback from people like, hey, Micah, 1 to 2 years of distributions money I need in cash is a lot of money on the sidelines. How about I go buy some bonds? Well, this is when I'm going to poke on the F fund right now, because in the F fund in 2022, the F fund lost almost 13%. That's a bond fund. Now, why did it lose? Is because bonds and interest rates are on a teeter-totter. Remember those things we used to have in school growing up that are now banned because they're too dangerous, right? Those teeter-totters, that's what they are, right? You got interest rates on one side, bond values on another. And when interest rates go down, bond values go up. But when interest rates go up, bond values go down. And that's what we saw in 2022. The Fed was raising interest rates, and we started seeing that teeter-totter kind of have that effect, and long-term bonds really being hit for this. Now, cash at the same time was, because rates were going up, cash was starting to make more money. 1, 2, 3, now it's at 4+% you could be making in cash. So that's the importance of correct investment diversification. Money I'm going to use, I need to have a timeline on when it's going to be available with minimal risk of loss. So the next 1 to 2 years, that's when our cash comes in. And then we have kind of, Christian, that 3 to 5 years. What do we kind of fill in that gap before we hit that last bucket?
That's exactly it, right? And then once we satisfied that, I'm thinking about for clients who are retired, once we have a minimum of that 5 years that are outside of the market, then we look at it and say, if we're looking at replacing income, and for our federal employees listening, our federal retirees, they've got the three-legged stool, the FERS pension, the Social Security income, and the TSP. If a lot of your income needs are being met from pension and Social Security, and we don't really need too much coming out of our TSP or our investments, then perhaps we can make the case we can even have more that's outside of the stock market, assuming we've met that 5 year rule, because our income needs are less. And we don't want to take on any more risk than we have to. So it's a case by case, client by client basis, but that absolutely is the case with that rule. And the 5 years is kind of that minimum. And then we can exceed that should we need to or want to with kind of our risk tolerance, but also how much we're actually taking out of the portfolio every year.
Yeah. And Christian, I know we're on the same page with this. And risk tolerance is an interesting buzzword, right? That gets thrown around a lot. And we got to be careful with that one, because this isn't just a computer response, answer these 5 questions, and this is how you should invest. It's really about cash flow. What does your money need to do in order to make sure you can have a successful retirement? That's kind of one of those top questions you got to ask. Now, if that's outside of your comfort zone, that's another question. We have some clients that really need to invest their money a little bit more long-term focused to hit the goals they want to hit. Okay, when we go through that, they're like, you know what? I'm not comfortable taking that much risk. Okay, then we need to adjust our goals, right? If we're not comfortable taking that type of investment risk, we can tone it down, but that means we're either going to have A, less money in retirement, or B, retire later. Or maybe it's a combination of the two. But there's only so many levers to pull. And where people get in trouble is they're saying, well, I don't want to take risk, but I'm not going to adjust any of my goals. That may not work out well for you.
Yeah, that's a very important distinction on that buzzword, that risk tolerance. It cannot just be simply answering these 10 questions and boom, you're at moderate aggressive growth, right? Or somewhere in that branch. You have to really look at it with more nuance and really understand a few other things first before we know what your risk tolerance is.
Yeah. And then one more other thing too, before we kind of deviate from this a little bit, then kind of talk about inflation, because that's kind of a big thing to be thinking about right now, is what is your plan to take money out of your investments, right? Even if you're not on the distribution side of it just yet, what's your plan to take distributions? And do you have that in writing? Now, in writing is really, really important. And Christian, I know we're on the same page with this because it makes it more real, right? And especially if you're married, it gets you and your spouse a little bit more aligned on the same page with things. But we got to make this a little bit more real. How are we going to pull this money out? What's the plan? And what happens, not if, but when the stock market goes down, what's our plan for taking money out in a down market? It's so much easier to figure out now when it's theoretical in the future it will happen versus in the moment. That's when our emotions can flare up a little bit more. And that's why having it in writing really helps with that, especially if we're sensitive to that market volatility.
100%. That's maybe a plug, but when we're working with our clients, that's what we're hearing as feedback is getting that in writing and really having that written plan. That's something they're appreciative of, and being able to identify what we call the retirement income timeline. It's a useful tool that we're using. And so even if we're not working together, but putting together some version of a retirement income timeline, knowing where your sources of income are coming from, and then those gap years that we would call before first supplement goes away and you're not turning on your social security and we're needing to take out a little bit more money, which is a common scenario. Where is that coming from and from which buckets? And not only between the CSI, GNF funds in the TSP, but outside the TSP, if we have more dollars. Maybe we've got some in a savings account. Maybe we've got some in a Roth IRA. Maybe we were planning to sell the house or the rental property. We want to get some extra money there. So there's a lot of different things. What is your plan to take that money out? And getting it in writing is super important.
Ooh, I like it. All right. So we're going to change a little bit from the investment conversation and let's pivot a little bit into inflation, right? That thing that's been biting us the last several years as groceries have gone up in costs. And this ties hand in hand with the investments as well, because this comes to the question about what's your plan when your expenses change in retirement? So often we think, oh, I'll be able to spend less. I'll be able to do these other things. Well, all of a sudden your grocery bill went up 20% in the last couple of years. And then it's like, well, holy crap, where's that money going to come from? And so having a plan, how do we outpace inflation, has to be part of this investment plan because you have a great retirement, Christian, as you already said earlier, right? You have a pension, which is going to come in, you have Social Security, but neither one of those will keep up with inflation. In fact, your first pension is designed to be less than inflation. If CPI, Consumer Price Index, is between 0 and 3%, you get the CPI. If it's between 3 and 4%, you get half that. But it's not designed to keep up with that inflation rate. So really important to say, hey, your pension's not going to. Your Social Security is not going to. Well, out of that three-legged stool, what's the one thing that you have that can outpace inflation over time? And that's your TSP. That's your IRAs. That's your Roth. That's your tax planning, by the way. We've used tax planning a lot with clients to beat the IRS out of thousands, tens of thousands of dollars. And that helps with our inflation planning because that's more money you have in your retirement. So how does that kind of come together in your investment plan?
That's exactly it. Inflation is something that a lot of times we're thinking about, and the TSP, our other investments, that is really the key, right, to beating inflation. Whether or not we know what's going to happen, I mean, we don't know what's going to happen in the future with inflation, so we just make sure we have that part of our overall plan, knowing we have to have some dollars that are invested, that are in growth. We can't just sit in cash because it will be eaten up with inflation.
Now, Christian, I want to pick on you on something you said, though. You just said, we don't know what's going to happen. And I'm going to push back on that one. I'll make this statement right here. I know exactly what's going to happen. And to prove it, I'll be back here a year from now and I'll tell you exactly what did happen. How does that sound?
That's a good answer there.
Yes, we're great historians, right? But yes, to your point, we don't know what's going to happen. The best way to know that is to look back in history, right? And look at all the pundits. And Christian, you and I were pre-gaming, and you brought up several pundits that were multiple times this year saying this is the end of it. It's all crashing from here. And I don't know, maybe by the time this podcast airs, it will have crashed. Probably not. And so these are long-term things that we need to look at and not get caught up with the market hype in the day-to-day. I know we talk about it a bunch. It's super easy to happen, especially coming into an election year. things will be more volatile because they
Yeah.
are every 4 years. We have elections every 4 years. I know you guys know that because our audience is really smart. The entire world is going to forget that. This is a normal thing. Every 4 years, and the market gets a little bit more volatile with it. It's just part of the fun, but that's why it comes in knowing what that investment plan is. And can we tolerate that volatility? Can we tolerate that movement when my TSP goes up 100,000, then down 100,000? Are we okay with that? How does that fit into our long-term plan?
Another thought, another point when we're talking about why our retirement is losing money would be our own fault with taking too much out. Call that overspending, right? And so, how are we set up for knowing how much in a given year we should be taking out of our accounts, right? If we've heard somewhere between 4% is pretty common, I've heard 3%, 5+%, right? Whatever that distribution rate is, if we're taking out more than that for a longer period of time, we're kind of in our own fault for why that we're losing that money. And so, how are we going to get back on track? That's going to start with you as well. It's going to start with your planning. It's going to start with cash flow planning and making sure we're good stewards of our money every single month. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
I agree. And this comes down to what's that written plan, right? Whether you work with a professional, whether you do it yourself, either way, it's what's that written plan that you have that when, not if, when these things happen, what are you telling your future self now, right? What are things that, I like to say, what are things that future Micah would like to know about this conversation when these things happen? That's the approach that we need to take with it and say there's a reason for we have a strategy when the markets go down, how clients are going to take out money. And there's also a reason, Christian, and you know this, we took a lot of advantage of it in 2022. When the market goes down, what are the opportunities that we have
Right.
with Roth conversions, with moving money over, with taking additional distributions, reallocating some things, right? There's always these opportunities. And yep, you're right. We're making lemonade out of lemons. You're 100% right. But we want to take advantage of when there are opportunities in order to improve your life, improve your finances. And I always find it, in the moment, we're going to have a blank slate. We're going to like, holy crap, it's a blank sheet of paper. I don't know what to do. But when we're thinking about it in ahead of time, it's a little easier to jot these things down. Like, oh, that's right. I said when the market was going to fall 20%, I was going to do that Roth conversion. That's probably still a good idea. And you should look at doing that. Hey, when the market's up, I shouldn't be greedy. I should probably replenish some of my cash. That might be a great idea, right? So what are some of these things that if you're going to do it yourself, you've written down in advance?
Agreed. Absolutely.
I love it. All right. Well, let's get on to some action items, right? This podcast is all about action. It's all about moving forward with the future and what are things that you can do this week. So I'll kick it off, Christian. I'll say the number one thing is what is your written investment strategy? So important.
Yeah. Very important. Well, I'd say the next action item would be as we're looking at every single year when it comes to taxes, when it comes to your portfolio, what are some of those opportunities that we're seeing that we could then be taking advantage of? There's always going to be those opportunities that come up. For one particular year, it could be that the market is down, like you had just mentioned. In other years, it could be, well, taxes are lower this year for me personally, right? Because I'm in this particular part of my life. So whatever those opportunities are you taking advantage of them? And if not, kind of add that as the action item to know what those particular sets of rules and benchmarks are to know what to do.
I like it. I like it. Well, another one I'm going to do, I don't know if our listeners know this or not, but I do enjoy reading. I like to read a lot, keep on top of things. I read generally over 15 books a year. And one of the ones that's on my reread list every few years is a slightly thick one. It is Stocks for the Long Run by Jeremy Siegel. This is the 6th edition that I have, but it is a fantastic book that really helps us understand how the market moves. Now, it's a thick reading. So if you don't like reading about investments, maybe that's not a book for you, but he really breaks down a lot of things and is like, well, why do we need to have this long-term philosophy with stocks? Why do we need to be thinking about the long term? And he breaks down all the facts behind it. So it's a great read if you're looking for, something to cure your insomnia. Maybe this will help, but it's something that if you're wanting to do the investments on your own, make sure you pick that one up. Make sure you understand how Stocks for the Long Run works. Well, perfect. Well, Christian, it's always a pleasure having you on the podcast. Thank you so much. And until next time, to our audience, happy planning.